first gift we will address is the gift of tongues. And I'll begin with you, Cory, and I'll ask you, what is the gift of tongues, and has it ceased?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, there is a lot of debate on this very topic when we're talking about the sensational gifts or the sign gifts. I think it's helpful if we're going to hammer out a biblical theology of tongues to start where they originate, perhaps, like where that spiritual gift for the church originated. For example, if I was going to want to learn about creation, I'm going to go to Genesis in the first two chapters to learn about the creation week. Well, this gift of tongues, this phenomenon of tongues started with the church in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit fell on the disciples and those who were with them, tongues of fire, it says. And they were able to preach the message of Christ to all the Jewish pilgrims that were there for Pentecost, one of the major feasts of Israel. Interestingly enough, the very words for tongues, which is glossa, and that should sound familiar to English speakers, because that sounds much like a glossary. And I don't want to be too anachronistic here, but if you think of a glossary, it's usually at the end of a book. There are real words that exist, right, in vocabulary with definitions. That's where glossa comes from, at least glossary comes from, glossa. These were real languages. And another word that's used on that day of Pentecost is dialecto in the Greek, which is where we get dialect. So what we see in Acts chapter 2, this incredible miracle of the Holy Spirit, tongues of fire, phenomenological language, spreads on the disciples, and they're able to preach in dialects and tongues, which is where we would get, say, glossa, which is also languages, real languages. In fact, in Acts chapter 2, it says all the regions and the countries, the nations where the pilgrims were from that were there, including Rome and Cappadocia and Galatia and all these different Phrygia, all these different regions that were there. They were hearing the message of God in their own languages. So I think it's helpful to start when we talk about tongues, we're talking about real languages. The Bible doesn't really give us any other reason to suggest otherwise, except perhaps some passages in Paul to the Corinthians about speaking in tongues or praying to something that's not beneficial to the whole group, but to themselves. He talks about praying in a tongue. But even there, it's spoken of in a way that's not so positive. The idea of the gift of tongues was to be able to preach the message of Christ, to preach even of judgment for not coming to Christ in people's language, native language that they can hear. What made it a miracle is that the people speaking the dialect or speak the dialecto or the glossa, the tongue or the language or the dialect, is that they didn't have training in it. So the miracle was they were given by the Holy Spirit the ability to speak in a known language for people to hear the gospel, basically.
So it's almost like a foreign language was just uploaded into their minds, in a sense.
I mean, how that miracle happens, and Ryan might have more to say on this than me, but it is a miracle. And when it comes to that, it's not scientifically proven. How to exactly the Holy Spirit give that gift, we don't know. It is something we embrace by faith. However, we do know that it did happen. It's in Acts chapter 2. And you see it throughout the rest of Acts.
Acts 10 and 11.
Right, exactly. Throughout in Acts 10, the Holy Spirit fell on Gentiles, and they're able to now speak in tongues. In Acts 19, I believe, with the elders in Ephesians. So you see it throughout the book of Acts, which, by the way, is a transitional book. It's a historical book showing these were early sign gifts that people that were apostles or were intimately connected with an apostle were able to have, and it seems to be for confirmatory purposes, to be able to confirm the message of Christ. So they're able to speak in languages that they didn't actually have, to speak in their language, so those people can hear the message of Christ.
Now, you said sign gift. What do you mean by a sign gift?
Yeah, so we have different types of gifts. And they're categorized by different people in different ways. A sign gift would also be more what I also call a sensational gift. Ones that I think have ceased. Now, is there a bulletproof text that say this? Not so much. We've got to be a little bit fair here. But I think collectively we do get that idea that certain sensational or sign gifts have ceased. Now, they're called sign gifts by some, to kind of distinguish that this was a miraculous gift to confirm a sign, and the sign being the message of Christ. So certain gifts were given like tongues, like healing, like words of wisdom and prophecy, perhaps. While the New Testament was still being written and codified, during that transitional period, people needed to have confirmatory messages, an understanding. How can we believe or trust what this is happening? The Pharisees always asked for signs as well to Jesus. So signs were something within that culture that it was like a miraculous idea. How can we trust this is happening? So there would be these gifts that would confirm the message of the apostles, the message of Christ, and it would be done in ways while the New Testament was still being written, things like speaking in foreign languages without the training, what we call tongues, or miracles given to certain people to have gifts of, say, healing and whatnot, or of prophecy, because, again, prophecy was still being written and codified in the New Testament, so the Bible wasn't finished yet, so they needed this sort of live, ongoing sign from the Holy Spirit that this is a message we can trust.
So in the book of Acts, because all we really had was, the Old Testament, and by the day of Pentecost, there was nothing yet. The New Testament, as we know, it wasn't written yet.
Correct. It's still being written.
Still being written.
So we know about these things, even what I'm talking about, by reading it in the New Testament. But put yourself back then, and you didn't have the New Testament. How would you know these things? How can you trust them? How do you know what? Because there were magicians even at the time that can falsify signs. In fact, you see that in the book of Acts with the sons of Sceva, right? And they wanted that power, of being able to proclaim the same Jesus that Paul does, and one that attaches himself to Peter, wanting the power so people can latch on to what they were doing. So there was this already at that time, what we would call charlatans today, with their false signs and stuff like that to gain a following. So there needed to be something, a legitimate, real, where there couldn't be any natural explanation for what was happening, and those were the sign gifts that were happening at the time.
Yeah.
So really, in a way, and I go back to this, it was a way to authenticate that they were really speaking from God.
That's the word I was looking for, authenticate. I was thinking like a confirmatory, authenticate the message, absolutely.